Thank you all for being here. My name is Duran and I'm Program Manager for the Climate Center. I'd like to welcome everybody here today. Thank you for joining us. We hope you're all doing well out there. We trust that you, your colleagues, and your families are staying healthy as we battle a growing list of crises, from fire and floods to power shutoffs, mass evacuations. Here in California, we've been through a lot in the last few years. Now we're faced with a growing viral pandemic that is literally killing people all around the world, stressing our economy and straining our political bonds in ways we've never seen. And at the same time, people are rising up in anguish over racial injustice and institutional brutality. And all of this is happening against the background of the climate crisis. And the climate crisis has not gone away. It's here as much as ever. And remember, the climate crisis is a force multiplier for wildfires, for economic dislocation, and for global instability. And that's why we at the Climate Center are more dedicated than ever to seeking and promoting solutions. We're promoting those solutions for the brave doctors and nurses. We're promoting them for George Floyd and all those who remember his name, and for all of us who call this planet home. We must address the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced, and we can and we will. And that's why you came here today to join our Resilient Schools, Safe Communities webinar. This webinar is part 3 of our 4-part series on community energy resilience. And it's going to culminate with a Clean Energy Policy Summit on August 5th, and we hope you will all join us then. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to just quickly do a little housekeeping. Please do set your Zoom screen to speaker mode, which you'll find in the upper right corner of your screen. It will improve your experience. And Q&A. Please keep those questions coming through the Q&A tab. And we'll answer as many as we can during the webinar, and then stick around with us as we answer those questions in greater detail towards the end. Lastly, I'd like to mention that we're going to do something that's analogous to what we used to do at conferences. Remember conferences when we would gather in hotels? You remember hotels? All those things are by the wayside right now. But we want to replicate some of that. So what often happens after a conference, after a speaker, everyone would gather in the hallway to ask more questions and have a continued conversation. So we will end this webinar right at 12 o'clock. For those of you who need to leave, that's fine. But if you'd like to stick around in the hallway, our speakers have all agreed to stick around to answer some more questions. So let me now ask Amanda to put up our sponsor slide. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, all of whom are working hard every day to craft solutions to the challenges we're talking about here today. The sponsors include TerraVerde Energy, Marin Community Energy, Calpine, Sonoma Clean Power, Bloom Energy, Monterey Bay Community Power, Reimagine Power, River City Bank, and Simplify. All of you are doing that crucial work. I also want to thank our partners. Next slide, please. Our partners, including the California Solar and Storage Association and Local Government Commission, have helped gather this incredible group of people together. And that's you, the 65 or more, 100 plus people who signed up for this important topic here today. Thank you all for joining us for Resilient Schools, Safe Communities. So with that said, here's a quick overview of what we're going to be covering today. Thank you, Amanda. We're going to have some introductions from Ann Hancock. We're going to hear from David Burdick of TerraVerde. We're going to hear from Scott Murdishaw of the Solar and Storage Association. And then David Burdick will be back to talk about some specific projects and some laws that are currently being considered that you need to know about. We're going to get case studies from Santa Barbara from Craig Lewis, and then again, time for your Q&A. So let me introduce our first speaker, Ann Hancock. Ann founded the Climate Center 15 plus years ago with the singular goal of addressing the climate crisis at speed and scale. Her accomplishments are too many to list here, but I will mention that Ann grows the most beautiful roses. So I'd like to turn it over now to Ann. Thank you very much. Ann Hancock, take it away.
Can you see me okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Duran. And I add my thanks to you, our co-hosts, partners, speakers, sponsors, and participants. And as Duran mentioned, we have so many crises that we're facing right now, and we feel the impacts and see just how fragile our current structures and systems are. The purpose of today's webinar is to become less fragile and more resilient by optimizing our schools as critical community resources, especially during emergencies. Community resilience is a key pillar of the Climate Center's work. Our mission, as Doron mentioned, is speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions starting in California. Our focus is policy as the key to unlock speed and scale solutions. One of our achievements is helping spread community choice. In California, in the last 10 years, we've gone from 0 to 21 community choice agencies that supply 88% greenhouse gas free electricity to over 11 million Californians, more than 1 out of 4 of our population. But this doesn't even come close to what we need to do according to the most current science, which we're about to highlight. Now, if you're like me, you might be thinking, do we really need to cover this? I already know it's urgent. We must keep each other awake on top of the most current science. Our work must adhere to the timeline that science mandates, daunting as this might be. First, consider the IPCC, the world's foremost authority on climate science. Its findings are bold compared with the political reality, especially in this country. However, the IPCC's findings are dated and conservative. Let's look at 4 examples of this year's most current science. This study from April 2020 found that abrupt ecosystem collapse could start this decade. From February 2020, abrupt permafrost thaw doubles the previous estimates of CO2 and methane from this source, which aren't included in previous climate models, including the IPCC's 1.5C report. From April 2020, the Western US is now in a global warming induced megadrought. And next slide, from March 2020, the number of fire days in California have doubled in the last 40 years. We post the most current science on our website for your reference. Because of this urgency, we launched our super aggressive Climate Safe California campaign. The goal is to have California enact by 2025 the policies required by science to dramatically reduce emissions, start drawdown, and secure resilient communities by 2030. The campaign aims to deliver speed and scale greenhouse gas reductions, close the climate gap, ensure a just transition for workers and their families, and inspire global action. We aim for California to commit and implement the climate targets that are aligned with the most current science. To achieve them, we will work with partners to advocate for California to pass policies in the 4 areas shown on this slide. We need widespread support to make this happen. One simple step you can take today to help us is to endorse this campaign as an individual and, if you can, as a business or organization. Already in the early stages of gathering endorsements, we now have 277, including many businesses, organizations, 2 congressmen, and a state senator. So I throw down a challenge to you all in this group right now to generate at least 10 new endorsements before this webinar ends. The link to endorse is in the chat. We'll give you the results at the end of the webinar. Back to you, Doron.
Thank you, Anne. That was great. Great little overview of where we are. And yes, absolutely. Climate Safe California is something I hope everyone on this call will be able to endorse. 10 would be wonderful. 74 would be better. So I'd like to now turn it over to David Burdick, who's turned on his screen sharing. David is Executive Vice President of Business Development for TerraVerde Energy. He spent the last 5 years as a leader in the renewable energy sector. Before that, he was a pastor and minister, which basically means that he's only had one career, serving people and making the world a better place. So thank you for being with us, David. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's conversation about resilient schools, safe communities. Such an important topic for today in our state. And we just want to start by sympathizing with any of our school participants who are on today's webinar. I work with school districts up and down the state, and the position that you're facing today is, the words unparalleled and unprecedented have been thrown around, and I think are certainly fitting, but it's an extremely difficult day for you and for your teams in the crucial work that you're doing. So we applaud your efforts and are excited today to support you with what we hope will be meaningful intelligence to support you in your planning for energy resiliency. We want to start today's conversation by talking about some of the financial benefits that are capable of being delivered through projects deploying solar and battery systems that can simultaneously provide backup power for your school facility sites, and then as well generate economic benefits. So allow me just to set the stage with a brief introduction here. First, TerraVerde Energy, we're a team of independent consultants. We work with public agencies, including school districts, and we're proud to support our school district customers with evaluating and deploying programs that generate these type of economic benefits and then increase energy resiliency. For example, we're in late stages commissioning new battery systems at Lancaster School District, where 10 new batteries are going to be used by both the school district and their local power provider, Lancaster Choice Energy. And these batteries are going to generate economic benefits for both the school district and their community power provider. And then 3 of these sites are going to be established as microgrids that can provide backup power during outages from either these wildfire-related power shutoff events, or for the Lancaster community, these earthquakes that they've been seeing of late. And so again, since our state is adjusting to this new normal, climate-related wildfire events and these increasingly regular power shutoff events are now putting schools in the position of figuring out how to continue operations when the grid goes down. And one of the solutions that we see many school districts exploring is deploying what are known as facility-level microgrids. These are energy resource groupings that pair on-site power generation with energy storage and other technologies so that your school facilities can continue to operate when the grid goes down, and either A, continue to educate your kids, or B, facilitate meaningful community resources during these critical emergency events. And the good news is that in many cases, these types of projects deploying solar and battery systems can provide both backup power and financial benefits. Let me just highlight for you some of those financial benefits. First, in the category of solar, as you're probably already aware, solar PV systems have the ability in many cases to provide electricity for your facilities at a lower cost than your electricity provider, thereby generating savings, cost savings. And what we're looking at here is a visualization of a portfolio of school district solar facilities in one school district, where they're now using their solar to meet almost all of their electricity needs and are procuring very little power from their electricity provider. And that solar power that they're procuring is at a cheaper rate than what they would have been paying to their electricity provider, thereby generating savings. What we see here in this screen is a monthly accounting for a particular site within that portfolio back in the 2017-18 fiscal period. And you can see here a comparison of what their utility bills would have been had they not deployed solar versus what they actually did spend on their utility costs. And you can see that over this fiscal year at this one location, this school saved $138,000 in energy costs. Now, there are costs for that solar. In this case, this school district has their solar provided by a third party, and so they have to make payments to that provider. But you can see here that their avoided cost benefits across their portfolio were some $1.9 million. They were able to generate income, which we'll talk about here in a moment, off of that solar portfolio, but they had expenses of $1.4 million to operate that solar during that year, generating $600,000 of benefit over the course of that fiscal period. So this is, again, high level how solar generates savings. In the category of revenue, solar is able to generate revenue through the certification and monetization of what are known as renewable energy certificates. If your district owns its facilities or has rights to these RECs in your third-party agreements, you could be in a position to generate revenue through selling these renewable energy certificates. The details of which we'd be happy to explore further in the Q&A, but there's a strong possibility that you could be generating, in addition to bill savings, revenue from your solar portfolio. Now, batteries is the newer topic, and batteries are able to generate both bill savings and revenue. When deployed at your facilities, your batteries can be used to provide your electricity when it's most expensive, or to target those parts of your electricity bill that cost the most. For example, your demand charges, or by playing with the time of use variability of energy rates. Batteries are able to discharge to meet your facility's demands when energy is the most expensive. Again, like solar, batteries can generate revenue. There are increasingly programs available through utility providers as well as CCAs for using your batteries, and they will share that revenue with you. Again, happy to tackle some of the specifics of that in the Q&A. But again, just a level set for the morning, these resources that can provide backup power can also provide meaningful financial benefits. Back to you, Duran.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was David, pardon me. Scott is next. Thank you, David. That was perfect, and you kept it right on time. Very impressive. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Scott Mertshaw. Scott is a senior advisor of the California Solar and Storage Association, which he joined after extensive work at the Public Utilities Commission and Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I'd like to point out that he has degrees from both Stanford and Berkeley, which means game day must be very confusing for Scott. So I'm not sure where your allegiances lie, but with the sun.
It causes a lot of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, fair enough.
Those days. I just try not to think about it too hard.
Good job. All right, take it away, Scott.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot. So I've just got a few slides. I'm going to try to keep it pretty short and just highlight the most important information that I think schools need to know about the Self-Generation Incentive Program. First, just a little bit of background about CALSA. We're a trade association, and we represent companies that are involved in the solar and storage industry and active in California that cover the full range of products and services, everything from manufacturers like Panasonic and LG to major solar installers like Sunrun and Tesla. TerraVerde is also a member. And then we also include several specialized firms that provide financial and legal services to customers and member companies. And a little bit of background too, just about the Self-Generation Incentive Program, just to put everything in a little bit of in more context. The Self-Generation Incentive Program, or SGIP, was originally launched in 2001 in response to the electricity crisis. And initially, most of the technologies that it funded were solar PV. In fact, the California Solar Initiative was spun off of the SGIP program in 2006, and combined heat and power. Now it primarily funds energy storage systems, but there is some tranche of funding that's available for renewable generation, and there's an incentive for heat pump water heaters that should be available soon. So let me go into what are the different budget categories that schools can avail themselves of to take advantage of the program. There are 5 different incentive categories, but 2 of those are for residential customers only. So I'm going to talk about the 3 that can pertain to schools. First, there's the large scale incentive. This is what we also call the general market incentive. This applies to any non-residential facilities that receive service from any of the big 4 investor-owned gas or electric utilities. So that includes PG&E, SE, SoCalGas, and SDG&E. This means that even facilities that are located in cities that receive electric service from a municipal-owned utility can also participate in SGIP through their gas companies. So this first category of incentives is pretty unrestrained, can apply to any facility anywhere in those service territories. And there are no performance requirements like providing backup power, and no limitations on income levels or disadvantaged community status of the facility. Now, soon we hope that a resiliency adder will be available as well. This was already approved by the Commission back in January, but it just hasn't been fully incorporated into the program. And the resiliency adder will provide a bonus incentive for certain kinds of critical facilities. There's a list of 23 different types of facilities that qualify as critical facilities, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. Then there's the equity resiliency incentive, which provides a much higher incentive for critical facilities that can document that they serve at least one low-income or disadvantaged community census tract. So even if the facility itself is not in a low-income or disadvantaged area, if it can document that it serves clientele or provides services to people in a disadvantaged community, you may qualify for the equity resiliency. You do have to be able to show that your system provides backup power to participate in that program, and I'll talk about some of those eligibility criteria here in a minute. The third category, excuse me, the third category is non-residential equity. This is for government agencies, educational institutions, nonprofits, and small businesses that are in or can also document that they serve certain low-income areas. But I won't talk about this incentive category any further because there's currently a wait list of over $300 million worth of projects. And even with a request to transfer funds from one category to another that has been made by CALSA and other parties, it won't be enough to cover that wait list, and I don't expect this incentive category to ever be available again. So let's move on to then what constitutes a critical facility. So these are facilities that provide important services and that are located in a fire zone. That's defined as sites in a Tier 2 or Tier 3 high fire threat district. These are areas of the state that have been delineated by the Public Utilities Commission in collaboration with CAL FIRE and other agencies. And any location that has experienced 2 or more public safety power shutoffs also qualifies, even if it's not located in one of these high fire threat districts. For the most part, these are generally medical facilities, police and fire stations, or public utilities like natural gas distribution centers or water treatment plants. And despite the best efforts of CALSA and some other parties who have been involved in that proceeding at the Commission, schools are not per se considered critical facilities. We asked the Commission to consider including schools, but for some reason we were not able to persuade them to do so. But if schools fall into one of 2 other categories that they may be eligible to qualify as, then they can access these resiliency incentives. So first is working with the investor-owned utility. You can become a utility designated community resource center that provides assistance during power shutoffs. Second is to become a designated cooling center as designated by a local government agency. And we are continuing to work on an option for local governments to also be able to designate these power shutoff resource centers. We don't think that the utility should be the sole gatekeepers with the authority to make that decision. We'll see if we can get the Commission to change its mind on those rules. So let's take a quick look at the incentive levels. So for the large scale general market incentive, this is currently set at $350 per kilowatt hour of energy storage capacity. And that incentive level will fall over time to another step that is $250 per kilowatt hour. Once the resiliency adder becomes available and a school is designated as a resource center or cooling center, then it could also access another $150 per kilowatt hour of capacity. And this helps to pay for the additional costs of all of the additional equipment and engineering necessary to provide backup capability. The equity resiliency fund for those critical facilities that serve low-income areas, that is much higher at $1,000 per kilowatt hour and will typically cover the full cost of an installation. It's important to note, you may have heard that there is a wait list for equity resiliency. That's just an artifact of the way that the funding was provided in 2 different phases. And we just recently received an announcement from the SGIP program administrators that an additional $500 million of funds that CALSA helped secure through the legislature in 2018 for the program, that will become available on July 20th. So that will easily cover the current wait list and provide funding for some time to come. Although at the current rate of uptake, those funds could potentially be gone within a couple of years or even less. So we would encourage schools that are interested in the program to begin to act quickly on identifying vendors and designing projects and submitting applications. All right, I just want to spend a couple of minutes here on the eligibility maps. So I mentioned that for a critical facility, it has to be in either a high fire threat district or have experienced 2 or more power shutoffs. And in order to qualify for the equity resiliency incentive, you also need to show that you serve at least 1 low-income census tract. This is a map that's available on the CPUC website. You can see the URL there at the bottom of the slide. And this is specifically the non-residential map. And what you see are three different shadings with some overlap. So the purple areas are the high fire threat districts. The orange areas are the electric circuits that have experienced 2 or more power shutoffs. And then the light green areas are the low income census tracts. What this means is that if you have a school that is in one of the purple or orange zones, then you may qualify as a critical facility and be able to take advantage of the resiliency adder. But if you are in one of the areas that is both green and purple, where those overlap, then you can take advantage of the equity resiliency incentive, which provides much higher incentives, but only for those areas that serve the low-income census tracts. There is an address lookup feature you can see in the upper right of the screen, where you can enter in a street address. There is one caveat, though, that the Commission does not guarantee that this necessarily qualifies you for eligibility. You would still need to verify that as part of the application process. All right, that wraps up my presentation. So there's my contact information if you have any other questions. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Doran.
Thank you, Scott. That was great. If you stop your screen sharing, that'd be wonderful. And that was a great presentation. And it's certainly nice to see that the state is getting behind a lot of these important policies. As we all know, policy drives everything. It's all about the policy, right? If you get the policies right, people will make the right choices. And you should find your stop share screen down there on the bottom.
Yeah, sorry, I am having, there we go.
That's all right.
It's a little confusing.
Got it. All right. Thank you very much. So without any further ado, let's keep things moving. I'm going to turn it back to David Burdick, who's going to be talking about evaluating deploying projects and also give us an update on some important assembly bills. So go ahead, David, back to you.
Great, thanks so much. So as we think about how to actually get these projects into the real world, I want to talk to you about the 4 stages of deploying facility microgrids. And today is, again, cursory overview, but just to give you a sense for what does it take to go from an idea to implementation of solar battery storage integrated microgrids. And those 4 phases include a detailed assessment, the procurement of those projects or services, the implementation phase where the projects will actually be constructed and deployed, and then some key considerations around the operational phase of these projects. So looking at the assessment phase, and again, these slides are going to be available to you at the end of today's presentation. There's a lot represented here, but this gives you a sense for what this assessment process might look like for your school district as it's exploring potential projects. First, there's an evaluation of how your facilities are currently using and paying for electricity, what kind of on-site resources do you have, and how would your district define the critical needs from an energy perspective. You may have facilities that need all of its electricity loads covered to be operational during an outage event. You may have a lesser, more critical subset of those loads. And so identifying how you're using and paying for electricity at your facilities is the first step. The second is exploring incentive eligibility. As Scott just described, this SGIP funding is a very helpful piece to the picture. There's other funding available, namely the federal investment tax credit, which could supply significant funding for new solar and battery projects. In addition, there are CCA programs that are increasingly providing incentives for these types of projects. And so exploring where can you find funding for these projects is part of that assessment phase. And then it's looking at, okay, based on your usage profile and the funding that's available, what's the intelligent way to right size solar and battery technologies from both a cost savings play as well as a resiliency play. And typically how we model that for our clients is to show them what do resources look like that are sized optimally for economic performance and what kind of financial benefits and resiliency benefits come off of that type of a project architecture. And then a second scenario is what resources are required to meet a more robust backup power profile. Maybe it's a multi-day outage for 50% of your loads at those facilities. That's going to be a larger resource set typically, and therefore will likely have a shallower economic profile than the more optimized, slimmer solar and battery resource sizing. And so getting an assessment of what does the opportunity look like for these projects for your district? Just to give you a heads up in terms of what you'll be procuring, you're going to be looking at on-site generation such as solar PV. You'll be looking at battery energy storage technologies. But you're also going to need the right controls and switching and load management technologies so that when the grid goes down, these resources can all continue to operate and provide the needed backup power for your facilities. I'll show you just a quick example of what this feasibility assessment might look like. This is a case example of a facility in the Northern California territory and PG&E's service territory where they're on a small commercial rate structure known as the A10 rate structure. And for this particular case, it was determined that the right size of a solar PV system was roughly 240 kW, which is a medium-sized commercial scale solar facility. And a battery energy storage system to provide 2 days of backup power would be, in this example, a 350 kW battery with four hours of duration behind it. And in this case, this facility does qualify for the richest of the SGIP incentives, this SGIP equity resiliency incentive. And so let's look at what the financial projections of this particular project looks like. Here you're looking at a cash flow pro forma showing the first 10 years of the life of this project, which is the typical warranted life of the battery energy storage systems. And you can see here for this project over that 10-year period is going to have a net financial benefit. So taking into consideration all of the capital and operating expenses and the financial benefits that come off of this project would have a $234,000 net benefit over the first 10 years. And that grows to $910,000 over a 25-year time horizon. So again, this is an example of the kind of assessment that you would likely look for to inform how you would then go to procure your projects. Now, when it comes time to actually procure your projects or your services, this typically includes a competitive solicitation or a request for proposals process. And some of the key elements you want to make sure that your school district includes is clear defined specifications for the projects and the services that you're expecting from these projects. And then one of the key elements I want to emphasize here is that you go to market with a contract that includes terms, including performance guarantee terms that represent your district's interests. And so come to the market looking for specific projects with already a contract that represents your interests. And then from there, once you've selected a vendor, there's going to be this implementation sequence that includes pre-construction activities where they're securing your incentives, they're finalizing design, they're getting permission from the utility to interconnect these resources at your facility. There's the construction phase where they're going to deploy equipment, they're going to set up their safety and construction plans, they're going to implement these projects on your facilities, and they're going to then get into the post-construction phase where these systems will be tested. And this is an all-important step, especially for these microgrids that are supposed to provide backup power during an outage event. It's crucial that these resources be tested before they're fully completed to make sure that they can, in fact, operate both when the grid is up and when the grid is down for their intended purposes. From there, in the operational phase of these systems, it's important that you've got the right plan to make sure that the performance of these systems is being monitored and measured, that the required maintenance that maintains the warranties and extends the longevity of these systems is being followed through on, and then making sure that your pre-deployment expectations are actually being achieved through the revenue targets or the savings targets that you've assigned to these projects. And that requires regular performance and financial analysis being done by your team or somebody on your team's behalf. One final thought before I pass the mic once again is there is meaningful legislation afoot. Prior to COVID-19, our team, along with many others, was supporting Assemblymember Phil Ting's office in getting Assembly Bill 3021, the Resilient Schools Initiative, approved by the state, which would have unlocked $900 million of additional funding for these school resiliency projects. However, COVID-19, funding availability dries up. The good news is that same program is alive in a different form under AB 1001, where right now this piece of legislation is poised to provide either no cost or low cost financing for school resiliency projects. So I encourage you, reach out to your representatives, encourage them to support AB 1001, which will unlock needed funding for school resiliency projects. With that, I'll pass the mic back to Duran.
Thank you, David. That's great. So much good information here. I do want to just emphasize a couple things before I introduce our next speaker. One is this entire webinar in recorded form, as well as the slideshow, will be posted on our website at theclimatecenter.org. We'll send a link to the specific spot, but theclimatecenter.org is also where you can find out about all of our programs. And once again, we urge you all to endorse, if you can, our Climate Safe California platform. Ann mentioned we're almost halfway to our goal, so a few more endorsements and we'll meet Ann's challenge. Also, please do keep the questions coming. We have a couple questions in Q&A and look forward to getting some more. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker to be talking about, he's going to be talking about Santa Barbara and San Marcos High School solar microgrid. Craig Lewis is founder and executive director of the Clean Coalition. Craig worked in a variety of businesses before starting the Clean Coalition, including banking and semiconductors, but now he focuses on energy policy, which is great news for all of us because these people get things done. So thank you very much for being here with us today and partnering with us. Take it away, Craig.
Pleasure, Duran. Thank you for the nice introduction. I'm going to be talking about the San Marcos High School solar microgrid. This is a project in the Santa Barbara Unified School District, and it really serves as a case study for a lot of what David was talking about. You know, the purpose of these solar microgrids in the Santa Barbara region are to get the trifecta of economic, environmental, and resilience benefits. And I'm going to be introducing a couple of new concepts in my presentation, including the value of resilience. And I'll just mention up front here that I have, I only have 10 minutes to present right now. So this is going to be brief. The slides are available. And I will be giving a deep dive into the value of resilience and the Clean Coalition's methodology for calculating that and valuing resilience in a webinar on August 11th. And that webinar is either already on the Clean Coalition website or will be soon. So with that, I'd give a little background. Santa Barbara Unified School District is in the Santa Barbara region. It's the primary school district here. It is in you can see all these pin drops on this slide on the map here. San Marcos High School is right in the middle. All of these pin drops you can see are comprised the Santa Barbara Unified School District, and they're surrounded by extreme fire risk. They're also surrounded by earthquake risk and landslide risk. The Montecito community here is part of Santa Barbara region, and that of course got the big mudslides that everybody I'm sure is aware of from a couple of years ago. Let's see, I'm gonna move quickly. As I said, it's really important to understand that the value of resilience is very real in the Santa Barbara region. In fact, the region is referred to as the Goleta load pocket because it is served by a single set of transmission lines that are routed 40 miles through extreme fire risk, earthquake risk, and mudslide risk, landslide risk, et cetera. That single set of transmission lines is in the purple trace you see in this map, comes up the backside of the mountains and terminates into what's called the Goleta substation. That substation is the only transmission substation that serves the Goleta load pocket. All of the other blue squares you see in this map, these are distribution substations, all of which are served by the Goleta substation, which is, of course, the namesake for the Goleta load pocket. This region spans 70 miles of beautiful California coastline from Point Conception to Lake Casitas, and encompasses the cities of Goleta, Santa Barbara, and Carpinteria. I want to be really sure people understand how vulnerable this transmission line is. Not only is a long transmission line, or any supply line for that matter, vulnerable, right? Long supply lines are inherently vulnerable. But this particular transmission line is super vulnerable. Southern California Edison, which is the utility in the region, has said very plainly that the transmission line is vulnerable to catastrophic failure from fire, earthquake, and/or landslides. that could cause extremely long-term outages for up to weeks or even months at a time. Not only is the transmission line super vulnerable here, but also the distribution lines. So this is a zoomed in view. You can see the transmission line in the purple trace. You can also see some other colored traces. Those are all distribution lines. San Marcos is it's marked by a star here. It's a little bit hard to see, but I'm moving my cursor around it, so hopefully you can see that. But San Marcos is right here. You can see that not only is the transmission route, but also the distribution lines that serve San Marcos, go right through that extreme fire risk, and it's also earthquake and landslide territory as well. So here's the San Marcos campus. It's a large public high school serving just over 2,000 kids, all in the high school grades 9 through 12. It's a Red Cross emergency sheltering facility, and the school features kind of everything you would expect from a leading large public high school. Lots of classrooms, large pool, gymnasium, football stadium, multiple baseball fields, tennis courts, basketball courts, etc. A cafeteria, auditorium, Greek theater. This is a really significant high school and plays a significant role in the community. And just for one interesting tidbit, it is where Craig Lewis, where I went to high school at part of class of '81, going back a ways. So the San Marcos High School Solar Microgrid Overview. It is designed for resilience and economic benefits, as David was talking about, right? Those two things sometimes can be a conflict with each other, but I'm gonna talk about, in a few slides here, I'm gonna talk about how those things can actually be optimized for the most overall value to a school or any other facility for that matter. In the case of the San Marcos High School Solar Microgrid, we've got 723 kilowatts of solar coming. By the way, this project is not yet built, but the proposals are due tomorrow. This is out for RFP. We're expecting some very creative and significant proposals. So the intent is that we're going to have 723 kilowatts of solar entirely in the form of solar parking canopies. That level of solar will get us to 101% of net zero energy. So we're going to be beyond net zero. The energy storage is going to be in the form of 710 kilowatt hours of energy capacity and 355 kilowatts of power capacity. And the critical loads that will be served, meaning that they will be maintained indefinitely. They can never turn off. They will be the food service refrigerators and freezers. And then that represents about 4.5 kilowatts of average load, which is about 3.5% of the total average load. So the tier 1 critical loads that can never be turned off is actually a very small percentage of the overall load at the campus. But those loads, those tier 1 loads, will have to be kept on indefinitely forever, right, until the grid comes back. The next set of loads that are important are the priority loads. We refer to these as tier 2 loads. You will keep those on as long as you can without having to threaten the ability to keep your tier 1 loads on. In the case of San Marcos High School, the tier 2 loads are the gymnasium lights and some plug loads, as well as the communication system, which they refer to as their main distribution frame. And those will be maintained for the majority of time. We're anticipating at least 80% of the time, those priority loads, the tier 2 loads, will also be maintained. They're about the same size as the tier 1 loads in the case of San Marcos High School. This is getting into the value of resilience methodology that the Clean Coalition utilizes. We call it the VOR 1, 2, 3 because it's the value of resilience, VOR, and it's using the load tiering, tier 1, 2, and 3, tiers 1, 2, and 3. This graphic here basically shows how the tier 1 loads, which are a small percentage of the load, on average, the tier 1 loads are about 10% of a site's loads, and you got to keep those on 100% of the time. The tier 2 loads are about 15% of the site's loads typically, so you got to keep those on for as much as you can. And generally, if you get to a level where you've net zero, you have enough solar to net zero the site, you're going to be able to keep those on at least 80% of the time. And then the remaining loads are all tier 3s, totally discretionary. Nobody's going to die if those loads go down. But you know, if you have enough solar to net zero, that means that on an average day, you're generating as much solar as you're consuming on the site. On the average day, you have 100% of your energy need solved by the solar. Now you're going to have a little bit of reserve that you're going to keep to make sure that you got your tier ones going 100% of the time, your tier twos having priority. But we are estimating that all 100% of the loads, including the tier 3 loads, can be maintained at least 25% of the time. Now, load management is critical here. As you can see, right, your tier 3 loads need to be turned off and on depending on energy availability. Your tier 2 loads need to be able to be turned off and on as well. And so load management is critical. This, by the way, it's the most immature element of doing solar microgrids is the load management, the ability to toggle tier 2 loads and then to toggle tier 3 loads as well. This block diagram basically shows the way we're anticipating that the load management will be achieved in the Santa Barbara, all of the Santa Barbara Unified School District solar microgrids, including San Marcos. The value of resilience methodology, I'm not going to go into the details here, but I will just remind you that, that I am going to be presenting the details of this methodology on a webinar on August 11th. You get that information at the Clean Coalition website. I do want to touch on this point around the state of charge, you know, that's needed for resilience and really the way that the battery capacity is managed, generally speaking. David did a nice job of talking about the fact that you've got some trade-offs to consider between, are you reserving battery capacity for resilience, or are you using the battery to optimize your economics through demand charge management, time of use arbitrage? The reality is that you can get both. And the way you get both is you minimize the amount of the state of charge that you're reserving for resilience in the battery and use the rest of the battery for economic optimization. Now, I'm going to go into the details of this on my August 11th webinar. I don't have time right now, but I will just say that the amount of energy that you have to reserve for your resilience, it fluctuates, right? It's dynamic. And this blue line, this blue, looks like a sawtooth curve, that curve shows what the state of charge for resilience is at every instant in time. We calculate that every 15 minutes. And the Clean Coalition's, what we call the SOCR, the state of charge, the minimum state of charge required for resilience, the SOCR, is dynamically calculated every 15 minutes based on forward-looking load and solar forecasts. And so at every instant in time, you want to minimize, you want the SOCR to be the minimum level it can possibly be, which means that you have as much of the battery reserved for economic optimization at every moment of time. For the San Marcos High School itself, we've got the solar microgrid basically has an annual cost of, in 2019, the annual cost of electricity was 15.3 cents per kilowatt hour. The value of solar only, if you just use solar, you're not getting optimum value for that energy, right? Because it's just being provided whenever the sun is shining. The solar alone is only worth 11.7 cents per kilowatt hour. It's less than what you're paying for the electricity to Southern California Edison. But if you put a battery on it, you can enhance the value of the solar plus storage gets enhanced by about 1.2 additional cents per kilowatt hour, gets us to 12.9. And then if you put the value of resilience on it, which the Clean Coalition has done a lot of research on this, the value of resilience is worth about 25% of the price that is already being paid for electricity. So 25% of that 15.3 gets added on top of the solar plus storage value and gets us up to 16.7 cents. A PPA starting at on 2019 cost of electricity at San Marcos High School, a power purchase agreement would have to come in at 16.7 cents in order to break even from the school district and get all that resilience value, of course, included. This is my last slide, and basically what this shows is that there's various ways to accomplish the load management. As I kind of hinted at before, the load management is the least mature element of doing solar microgrids. Everything that's shaded in green here is where we believe that the Santa Barbara Unified School District has solar microgrids that will be coming that will make economic sense. And I know I'm over time, so with that, I will save the rest of my comments for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was great. A lot of great information. Again, what I'm going to ask is you stop your screen sharing. I'm going to ask all the panelists to turn their video back on so we can see everybody. Yeah, great stuff, Craig. Well done. So interesting. And David is back. And we've gotten a few questions through the Q&A. And I encourage you all to ask additional questions. I also wanted to just point out before we get into the Q&A that we've already exceeded our endorsement goal for Climate Safe California. So thank you all very much. And I know that, you know, David and Craig, you guys have already endorsed, if I'm not mistaken, Clean Coalition was early on the list. So take it on back to your organizations and let's get this train rolling. Let's move to some questions and please ask more if you have them. But I'm going to ask a question from Van Craig. This one goes directly to you because it's specifically related to the talk you just gave. The climate in San Marcos is relatively stable. Have they considered using heat pumps to control the climate systems there?
That's a great question. You know, the Clean Coalition, we're a nonprofit organization and our mission in life is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And I can tell you that we have to work really hard to not turn everything into a Christmas tree, right? With, you know, trying to hang every ornament we possibly can. I have to, you know, contain myself all the time. So the answer is no, we have not looked at heat pumps for the Santa Barbara Unified School District. This was a very targeted initiative around getting solar microgrids on those sites. There's probably lots of energy efficiency and electrification benefits that can be brought to San Marcos and all the other schools. But at this time, it's just, we're very focused on the solar microgrids there.
Wonderful, thank you. And I see Alice raised her hand, but I want to take a follow-up question first, and then we'll get to Alice. This comes from Scott Meinzen. Scott asked Scott, so this is for you, Scott Murdishaw. Would you please share more, and this is related, would you share more about the forthcoming SGIP incentives for heat pumps, and specifically heat pump water heaters? So one of our attendees would like to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, to be honest, that's not a part of the program that I've tracked that closely because it's not that relevant for most of our members. But I just looked over some of the language from the decision from January that approved the additional funding from Senate Bill 700 that we helped secure and that made various other program changes. So the total budget stands at $45 million for heat pump water heaters, but the commission is still working with parties and program administrators to figure out how to set the incentive amount. How, you know, what is it? What is even the unit for storage? It's per kilowatt hour of capacity. How will they define that for heat pump water heaters? And then how will they measure GHG savings from heat pump water heaters? They have methodologies for storage, but they don't have one for heat pump water heaters that's been approved yet. So there are a few implementation details that have to be worked out.
Wonderful, thank you. That's the best answer I think we can give right now. So it's working its way through the bureaucratic channels. So here's another good question. Scott, you may want to address this and others may want to also. Very specifically from Dana Smith, how does a community center in a high-risk fire zone, both in Tier 2 high risk and from the PSPS events, get designated as a cooling center or special local facility? What do you need to do to get that designation?
Yeah, I don't know if David, if you've looked into this at all. I've tried to find information on the web and I've heard bits and pieces from various members. I mean, my understanding is that local governments have the authority to do this, and I'm not sure if maybe local OES or regional OES, Office of Emergency Services, also has similar authority. But I really don't understand the process.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It is jurisdiction by jurisdiction specific. So you just need to talk to your local government partner, city or county, express that you're interested in becoming a cooling center, particularly for this program. They should already have a defined path, and you'll just need to represent when you submit your SGIP application in some form of documented fashion that your local government has in fact designated your facility as a cooling center. The alternative path is the PSPS designation from the investor-owned utilities. So if you're in the PG&E, Edison, or San Diego Gas and Electric markets, I've seen the Edison agreement. They've actually got a contract out where it has specified terms and conditions. And PG&E's, I think, is forthcoming. I haven't seen a copy of it yet, but there's also specified paths for the investor and utilities. But my recommendation is start with your local government, build the partnership there.
Great. Thank you, David. It's an important question. It can unlock a lot of additional funding for schools. So knowing how to navigate that process is going to be important for them. Question from Terry Taylor, and this one's close to my heart as an EV driver who used my Nissan Leaf to keep my freezer cold last year during the power shutoffs, understanding that that was just a hack, and I don't recommend anybody do it. There's a question from Terry. Can EV batteries serve as backup power to solar and battery powered microgrids? David, you're on the call. What do you think about EV batteries? Where are we today and what can we expect in the future?
So the answer is yes and yes. So yes, right now there are vehicle to building applications. It requires specific configurations of your vehicle and your charging infrastructure and your loads on site. So just because you have an electric vehicle does not necessarily mean that you can use that battery for backup power immediately, but there are applications for that currently. That's an application that's being even further explored in mobile resiliency benefits of fleets of, say, school bus fleets or municipal bus fleets, where these mobile backup, these mobile batteries could be used as a critical backup power supply for the medically vulnerable residents within a community or for key critical facilities. We've participated in some grant applications for developing pilot programs along those lines, but this is an evolving application of those mobile batteries as being utilized as a stationary backup battery during these outage events.
Great. I just want to see if anybody else from our panelists wants to address that question. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, this is also not an area of deep expertise. I've talked to some members who've done this either for their own homes or have helped people do it. There are some concerns. I'm not sure that there's a utility approved process for doing that. And there are, for all kind of EV to grid or maybe EV to home uses of electric vehicles, there are in some instances, maybe for most manufacturers, concerns that this could void your warranty on the battery. It's not an approved use of the battery. I don't know how much that's changed among manufacturers in the last couple of years, but I know that has been a big impediment in the past to V2G, vehicle to grid.
I think that's a good point, and I think the only new car that is currently approved for V2G, although it does depend on the technology you're using, is the Nissan Leaf, because they're already deploying V2G two-way charger systems in Japan. But we're getting so close. And I mean, you think about the capacity of all those batteries in the 500,000 plus electric cars already here in California and the millions more to come. It's going to make a big difference. So I'd like to move to just some closing comments. I see there's still questions coming, a couple questions. I want to thank our panelists who've been answering the questions both here on the video and through the Q&A portal. Some of the questions got answered directly. There's one from Claire that's very specific. Maybe you guys want to take a look at that. If we could clear some of those questions out, that would be great. But before we move to our little hallway chat, we will stick around if anybody wants to ask any additional questions. I just wanted to take a moment again to thank all of our sponsors and partners, our speakers who are here, Scott and Craig and Dave, our sponsors, MCE, TerraVerde Energy, Calpine, Sonoma Clean Power, and the rest. And our partners, California Solar and Storage Association, thank you for being part of here. And remember, this webinar is part of a series on community energy resilience that we at the Climate Center are putting on. We want to invite you all to return to this space on August 5th for our Community Energy Resilience Policy Summit from 9 to noon. That is going to be an absolutely fascinating morning where we're really going to dive deep into what we need to do to unlock the policies to make all this possible. Once again, thank you all who endorsed Climate Safe California. Those of you who have not and would like to, please do go to our website where you can find out about all these things at theclimatecenter.org. There's lots of ways to engage with us and support us. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to formally end the webinar, but encourage anybody who wants to stick around for a few more minutes to answer any additional questions. So thank you all for being here, and let's step out into the hallway and keep this conversation going. Okay, So here we are. We've got a couple more questions still in. Just one at the moment. If we get designated as a cooling center, is a question from an anonymous attendee, and the current eligibility maps are all drawn exactly around the campus boundaries, but that does not include the campus in the eligible categories, can we still qualify for an incentive? In other words, the incentives, I think, are still a little complicated for people to understand. Do we have to be an eligible category and be designated as a cooling center to qualify for resiliency incentives? Scott, can you parse that question out and perhaps provide some context, some answer?
Okay. Yeah, and I was in the midst of responding
Oh,
through
great.
the Q&A feature, but was waiting for you to finish reading it. I just responded to that person, but yeah, maybe just addressing it in real time here could be useful because I'm not entirely sure I understood. So the school does need to be in a tier 2 or tier 3 high fire threat district or have experienced 2 or more power shutoffs. That's true for all critical facilities. You can't serve a community that's experienced a power shutoff and not have experienced the power shutoff yourself or be in one of the high fire threat districts. You do need to meet that eligibility threshold. And then let's say the school has been designated as a cooling center, then it can avail itself of the equity resiliency funds if it serves a low-income community, at least one, or the resiliency adder if it can't document that it serves any disadvantaged or low-income communities.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Scott, can I follow on to that since we're, out in the hallway, so to speak?
Yeah, let's go.
And this was actually just a follow-on question to Scott because he's the expert on this. And I was not aware that the school or whatever critical facility site didn't have to be in the high threat zone itself. So that's
No, the critical facility has to be in the high fire threat district.
Or impacted by 2 PSPS events.
okay.
But it
So
doesn't have to be.
I'm using the term critical facility a little too loosely, probably. In my mind, a critical facility would include a school that's a Red Cross, emergency sheltering site, which I don't think is part of the definition. So I'll be
It's not part of the official. Yeah.
Okay.
Cooling center as designated by the local government. That would be the swiftest path to get that particular site qualified as a critical facility.
Okay. So here's my specific question, and you might have answered it. I apologize for this repeat, but so if you have a school that is, serving as a cooling center, and it's not in a high threat fire zone itself, but it serves people who do live in those zones, is there any pathway?
So not currently.
In that case, let me make sure I understand because there's 2 different dimensions. There's the extent to which a facility is at risk of experiencing a power shutoff. And so that's basically captured by the high fire threat district, or you've experienced 2 in the past is a good indication you will experience them again in the future. Okay. Is it at risk? Does it serve low-income communities? So let's say the critical facility is at risk of experiencing a power shutoff, and it serves at least one low-income or disadvantaged community as defined by the PUC, then it qualifies for equity resiliency. If it's at risk of a power shutoff because it meets these criteria of being in a high fire threat district, et cetera, but is just in a well-off part of the state and doesn't have a single census tract that it can show that is a qualifying low-income census tract, then it qualifies for the general market incentive. Let's say right now, $350 per kilowatt hour of capacity plus $150 resiliency adder.
If it's a cooling center.
Yeah.
If it's a cooling center, yeah. This is a little bit of a maddening dynamic right now. I can show you examples of school district campuses where they are surrounded by high fire threat, literally on 4 sides of their campuses, but have not been impacted by a PSPS event yet, and therefore can't qualify for any of the more rich SGIP incentives. And it's just, you pull your hair out, right? Because here's the school campus and it's just nothing but red all around them. And, but it's the way the rules are currently written.
San Marcos is surrounded by red and had suffered many PSPS events.
So then the PSPS experience is what gets them across the finish line. So they don't have to be in a designated high fire threat zone if they've experienced more than one PSPS event. So you've got your you know, call it power reliability designation from that, then get them designated as a cooling center. And if they are serving either a low income or disadvantaged community, then you can get that equity resiliency.
So the cooling center designation is a little bit irritating because that requires.
Yeah.
Whereas a Red Cross emergency sheltering site seems like it's way more significant than being a cooling center.
Yeah, the definition we would like to see is that local governments can just define them more broadly, and it doesn't require that, you know, specific designation as a cooling shelter, but that is right now the swiftest path.
Okay.
And that would just literally be going to your city council or your county board of supervisors and having them say, when we've got no power and it's hot, people need to cool off, they're coming to you.
We dub you a cooling center.
Okay.
Yeah, they'll have to give you some paper in the dubbing because you'll need to turn that into SGIP's program administrators, but
so that's a municipal designation, not a utility designation.
So there is a utility designation path. It's complicated, especially in SCE's territory. I've seen the contract. It's a contract, and I think has a lot of barriers for a lot of folks to say yes to it. The local government designation, just have them reach out to if they're in city limits, have them reach out to their city representatives. If they're in county territory, have them reach out to the county. Here's the project. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. How do we get designated as a cooling center?
Perfect. Thanks.
Well, that's all.
And just one other quick clarification. Outages per se do not count. They have to be public safety power shutoffs. Outages related to the prevention or mitigation of wildfires.
Intentional shutoffs. Unintentional shutoffs don't do anything for you. Only the intentional ones do.
The intentional shutoffs, yes.
Got it. All right. That's good to know. This is all great information. Listen, it looks like we've still got about 40 people, but I don't see any more questions coming in. I think you guys have done a great job answering all the questions. It's the first webinar I've ever participated in where we literally answered every single question. So I think that's wonderful. I really want to thank you all. I just want to give each of you a chance if there's any last words that you want to share, anything you want to send as like last words of wisdom for our attendees. Now's a good time. Raise your hand. I think you've all done a great job. I just want to say thanks. Alice is thanking all the panelists. So is Marian Bithell. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of this important topic. And to all you panelists, we'll be in touch for follow-up. And I want to let everyone know that the webinar recording will be on our website. Again, all that information is at theclimatecenter.org. We'll include bios of these guys as well as their slideshows so you can dig deeper in all that great information. So once again, thank you all for coming. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay cool. We'll see you later.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.
All right.